Hey everybody. So about a month ago, another YouTuber named SciManDan created a video about my evolution hoax video that I did a couple years ago. SciManDan, who seems to be an atheist, took issue with a few of my points, which I would like to address now. After he made his video, I immediately tried to do a live unedited video discussion with him, which would have been great for his channel if he was confident enough to easily break apart my arguments. I'm sure his followers would have loved to see that, and I'm sure he's constantly looking for content for his channel. Well, it's been a month and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So I've decided to make this video because many of his followers came over to my channel to click on my evolution video, to then not watch it, dislike it, and then leave a harsh comment. I know they didn't watch it because the YouTube analytics came out showing about 3,000 new views with an average view duration of 1 minute, even though my video is about 17 minutes long. I had actually predicted this type of behavior in my evolution video. The fact of the matter is that this is really not about science. If it was about science, there wouldn't be this rage when you bring things up like this, because I guarantee that a lot of hate will come from just watching this video. And why should it really, if this is just a scientific theory we're just debating and questioning? There shouldn't be any hate attached to it. It's just, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. If it's right, it's right. It's wrong, it's wrong. There really shouldn't be any hate. But when you watch videos like this, you see hate in the comment boxes. It has to be true. Evolution has to be true. How dare you ask any questions about evolution? And why is that? This section, of course, didn't stop them because those people didn't really watch the video, and so they never got to see that part. So, as SciManDan's followers think he has made a lot of good points for evolution, let's go through them. Here you'll see little clips from my evolution video focusing on whale evolution, and then clips of Dan talking about them. Let's start here. Well, I think we can see that just if we make the analogy of a factory that creates cars. You can have a process of a factory and that can create a car, but just because you have a process does not eliminate the fact that you have someone that designed the factory. Didn't really get why atheists were using evolution as one of the main points to say that God didn't exist.
Atheists don't ever use that as an argument that God doesn't exist. We usually defend evolution as being true, not use it to go on the offensive.
So, as I used to be an atheist, I know that this is not true. Richard Dawkins, who Dan is going to talk about later, is quoted in saying that, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. This means Dawkins thinks that Darwin's theory of evolution provides evidence against God. It doesn't stop there, because recently famous atheist physicist Lawrence Krauss tweeted about a recent scientific experiment, saying that evolution in the lab beats intelligent design. Again, this points to the idea that evolution and God are in some sort of competition. So obviously famous atheists do use evolution as a way to object to God. Now, the problem with this is that nothing competes with God as an explanation to the universe or to biological life. All explanations attempting to compete with God fail at a certain point, and before we go further, I'm going to show this using the words of a famous atheist, an agnostic interviewer, and one famous former atheist. Let's start with the words of famous atheist physicist Leonard Susskind in an interview about the recognized fine-tuning of the universe.
Okay, we have fine-tuning. We've got to deal with it. Now, there are a number of ways that we can explain that. I mean, it cries out for explanation.
Yes.
We cannot say, oh, yes, fine, and let's go on. We have to explain it one way or another.
Basically, there are three explanations.
Okay, number one.
Okay, God.
Number two. that one I understand.
Right. Accident.
Okay,
Right,
that strains
being,
credulity just by on its face value.
Right.
So it's an accident just that way, and it happens to work out perfectly.
Right. 123 decimal places, zero, not likely to be an accident. The last way, which physicists don't like, they don't like it because it runs against their ambitions. The ambition was to explain every constant, every number, to understand everything about the universe. The other way goes as follows. The universe is enormously big. We know that, incidentally. And when I say enormously big, I don't mean like we used to think 10 billion light years. Right. I mean 10 to the 10 to the 10 to the 10th. We have no idea how big it is. Enormously big. We suspect that it is very much bigger than the region we can see. We also have reason to believe that it's diverse. For those of us who believe in this particular picture of a tremendously diverse, some people call it a multiverse.
So even an atheist physicist will admit that God is in the top 2 explanations for the fine-tuning of the universe. SciManDan, though, wants to go with the multiverse theory as the best explanation instead of God, even though we really have no solid evidence to support this theory, and it seems to me that random access is going to fall into this explanation as well, even though that explanation was rejected earlier by SciManDan. But for the sake of argument, let's go with the multiverse theory for a moment. A big problem for this theory is the reality of the greater fine-tuning of biological life, which includes life existing at all. To further explain this, let's go to the words of a former world-famous atheist who turned to theism near the end of his life.
What were some of the factors that prompted you to, in recent years, reconsider atheism and to come to the conclusion that that there is a intelligence?
It's been entirely these, I suppose, biological discoveries and discoveries about the chemistry.
So
these things.
The complexity and...
Yeah, the integrated complexity argument.
Now, when you talk about the integrated complexity,
Yeah.
is it the unlikelihood of that developing naturalistically, the first complex integrated biological system? Is that where the problem you saw?
Well, yes, because after all, there is a problem about even, well, of physical nature. There's a, it's, if the integrated complexity of the physical world is a good reason, as Einstein clearly thought it was, of believing that there was an intelligence behind it, then this argument applies a fortiori with the inordinately greater integrated complexity of the living world. It seems to me this is just obvious that that argument is much stronger now.
And this was one of the factors that led you to conclude there must be an intelligence.
Yeah. It was accepting Einstein, who after all was the person who was qualified to judge, and seeing that a fortiori this applied where, of course, Einstein didn't have any authority at all and wasn't inclined reasonably enough to talk about it.
So while one could go with the multiverse theory for a brief moment, we find that this explanation is going to fail when we get to the fine-tuning of biological life. Like Flew is saying here, all the available evidence points to outside intelligence being the source of what we see around us. Inanimate atoms really don't have the power to sequence or shape themselves. Inanimate atoms, like this lump of clay, don't do too much on their own. It takes great intelligence to sequence inanimate atoms into a complex shape, even greater intelligence to create amazingly complex systems inside that shape, and far greater intelligence to make that entire structure come to life. To further illustrate this point, let's go to the opening of the 2016 World Economic Forum on Artificial Intelligence.
What is AI? Let's start with a question. What do you think the most complex object is? Let me assure you, the answer is in your head, literally. That's because it is the human brain. The most complex networks, the most powerful systems cannot match it.
Professor Stuart Russell, one of the leading minds in AI, goes on to admit this about consciousness and the brain.
I'm not at all optimistic about the possibility of uploading our minds into machine hardware and living forever. And one of the reasons is we have absolutely no scientific theory of consciousness whatsoever, and there's no guarantee that anything would survive the upload process, even if we could actually get all the information out. We don't understand the signals that the brain uses to control its effectors, right? Its arms and legs and so on.
So in recognizing the failure of the multiverse theory at the point of biological life, the only explanation left on the table is Susskind's first explanation.
Number one.
Okay, God.
So nothing competes with God as an explanation. So, in now knowing this, if you are unwilling to recognize God as the best explanation, You do so out of your own emotion, not empirical evidence or logic. In understanding this, the question then becomes whether or not God used evolution to create the life we see around us. In looking at the brain, evolution looks to fail pretty quickly, because it seems really necessary for intelligent guidance to make this complicated goal happen. And intelligent guidance and goals are things evolution doesn't go along with. But let's go on to the rest of SciManDan's points.
Does anyone recognize a problem there? Do you see the differences just in appearance of those two creatures?
Yes, I can see a difference in appearance. What's your point? One is a species alive today, and the other lived around 50 million years ago. Now, you did have some credibility at the start of this video, but then you laugh like that and your ignorance slapped me in the face like a wet fish. Let me ask you a question. Would you laugh at the difference between a Pakicetus and this animal? Probably not, right? Well, they both share a common ancestor, so why would you, hey? Okay, what about these two animals? This is an Ambulocetus from the last picture with a Cucucetus. No, I wouldn't laugh at that either, they look quite similar. Let's try again. What about the Cucucetus from before and this, a Rhodocetus? Yeah, I don't think that's funny. Rhodocetus and a Dorudon? Dorudon and a whale? Wait, would you look at that? It's almost as if you need a succession of transitional species to get from an animal in the past to one that's alive now, like how evolutionists explain it. Wow.
Again, the problem is that we are assuming that evolution is true. If you think about things being created, then similar looking things would simply be independent creations that look similar. You can have a rake, a hammer, and an axe, and just because they have a similar handle wouldn't indicate they evolved from each other. This is the same when it comes to bone structure. Why would we automatically say these evolved from each other instead of saying that these are independent creations, created at different times, that simply have similar features, like the rake, hammer, and axe have similar features? The reason is because they are assuming that evolution is true first, while rejecting outside design. When it comes to these pictures being shown by Dan, it's easier to accept the theory when they draw similar looking features back to back. But that's not what the true evidence reveals. Darwin originally thought that the whale started as a bear creature, and I recently heard the whale's origin explained like this on NPR's Science Friday.
As unusual as it is, I always try to tell people, imagine you have like a dog-sized hippo kind of hanging out in the nearshore waters, and that would be sort of the precursor to what would eventually become the giant whales that we know today.
So when you change this rat-like creature to this, it kind of makes things a little more difficult. What a lot of people also don't know is that before 2001, these Pakicetus drawings were based solely on portions of a skull, not a full skeleton, which means they really knew nothing about the way it looked and somehow were able to put out full body drawings. As of today, this is the most complete skeleton we have for Pakicetus, even though the researchers admit that this is pulled from a pile of bones of many different animals, which actually makes it impossible to identify all the bones for one skeleton. So this is just a created composite, and who knows if all the bones are correct. This is the same when it comes to other fossils down the whale evolution line.
When this video series was being filmed on location at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the executive producer noticed a discrepancy between museum drawings of Rhodocetus and the fossils. The reconstruction of Rhodocetus had a whale fluke, but there were no fossils of the tail to confirm this. Dr. Phil Gingrich, the scientist responsible for the discovery and reconstruction of Rhodocetus, was questioned how he knew there was a whale fluke on Rhodocetus, since that part of the fossil was missing.
What was the reasoning that the scientists think there was a fluke on Rhodocetus based on the other pieces of anatomy?
Well, I told you we don't have the tail in Rhodocetus. So we don't know for sure whether it had a ball vertebra indicating a fluke or not. So I speculated it might have had a fluke.
Scientist Gingrich also acknowledged that the flippers were drawn on the diagram without these fossils. Now, he does not believe this animal had flippers. Again, his answer was surprising, since the museum diagrams had flippers on Rhodocetus.
Now since then, we've found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arm, the arms, in other words, of Rhodocetus. And we understand that it doesn't have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale. And if you don't have flippers, I don't think you can have a fluke tail and really powered swimming. And so I now doubt that Rhodocetus would have had a fluke tail.
Many experts consider whales to be the best fossil evidence for evolution, but are unaware of these discrepancies. Opponents of evolution contend that whale evolution is nothing more than hopeful supposition. If museum diagrams are redrawn and corrected for various discrepancies, opponents argue that whale evolution is non-existent.
When I laughed about the pictures at the beginning, I did so because I immediately thought of all the problems of the transition, not just the outside appearance. But when it comes to the appearance, like I've just pointed out with the incomplete skeletons, this looks to be based on assumption and propaganda. Let's go on.
Here is the transition sequence of the whale.
Oh, bless him, he thinks we've just found one of each fossil. Just as an example, if we look at the Pakicetus that you first mentioned earlier, we've found 4 different species of that alone.
Well, what I know is that we only found a couple pieces of skull before 2001, and a composite skeleton placed together from a big pile of bones after 2001. Also, my point is about the many transitional fossils that need to be shown within that handful to account for the massive internal/external changes needed to change the land creature into a whale. We should see a massive number of transitional creatures instead of the small handful.
There's a problem with that, and the questions that lead to that big problem are actually very simple. To start, what led to the creation of the land-dwelling creature?
The evolution of sea-dwelling creatures.
Not Pakicetus. It wasn't sea-dwelling. What led to Pakicetus? That's the question.
You know, this is a common thing within evolution, that you start at a fully formed creature and then evolve to another creature. But that's really not how things are supposed to have started.
Indeed they aren't. Evolution never starts at one creature and ends up with another. It's a continuous process that will never have a finished article.
Except the evolution of the whale tries to start at one creature, Pakicetus, and I want to know how we got to Pakicetus. If I'm just supposed to shut up and accept without my questions being answered, then this is slipping really far away from science.
It ebbs and flows through time, moulding the species of this planet. You either survive as a species, or you don't.
Again, this is an assumption that is used to try to replace God. He says it molds the species of this planet, instead of the outside intelligence doing the actual molding. Evolution is supposed to be a process. Well, there's also a process or a set of steps in the lighting of a candle. But the set of steps doesn't actually light the candle. It also doesn't create the candle. These things are going to come from an outside intelligence, which proclaims, "Let there be light."
So another question is, why did this land-dwelling creature change into a whale? Do we know? Or are we just taking a guess?
You really have no clue, do you? The skull of Pakicetus shows a thick bony wall surrounding the ear region. This is not seen in any other mammal other than, you've guessed it, whales.
Well, I actually know a bit more than you think I do. For example, this is not a Pakicetus skull. These are examples of 4 Pakicetus skulls. Notice a difference? Not really complete, are they? Also, notice how it's said that the snout is missing. And yet we find a blowhole-like structure at the top of the snout in your picture. Actual research puts the nose at the very front of the snout, even though they don't have the nose. So why are people making these fake Pakicetus skulls with a blowhole on top? The reason is because it makes it easier to accept the evolution of the whale when you add this misinformation to it. When it comes to that thick bony wall, you are wrong to say that only whales have this feature, because recently another animal called Indohyus was discovered to have the same feature. This is not in the cetacea whale family like Pakicetus supposedly is, and is also supposed to be a few million years younger than Pakicetus. The one thing they share in common though is the level of propaganda. Like Pakicetus, we can somehow draw a full picture of Indohyus from this incomplete skeleton, even though it's admitted that, because of surrounding bones, we don't know which skull went with which bones, and that these bones were found scrambled with many other bones.
The fossils of Ambulocetus were found in sediments that comprised of an ancient estuary, which suggests a semi-aquatic life. This is further supported by the ratio of oxygen isotopes found in the fossils, showing an equal amount of ingestion of both salt and fresh water. Whales that evolved after Ambulocetus showed even higher levels of saltwater oxygen isotopes.
Well, first off, Pakicetus didn't really have anything to do with saltwater, as described here, even though the main researchers of this whale evolution constantly put out mixed messages.
Discovered most recently in 2001 is the skeleton of Pakicetus, the first known whale, which didn't look anything like a whale. It really looked like a wolf or so if you would see it in a zoo. However, we know that this was already an aquatic animal because of the structure of its bones. They are very dense. This was probably an animal that was wading in shallow water. It was not a swimmer.
So it's described as aquatic, but that it's not a swimmer, that it might have simply waded in shallow water. Do you see the mixed messages here? You know what? I've waded in shallow water. Does that really make me aquatic? Does that mean my descendants are going to turn into whales? Whales supposedly evolved because their ancestors were around the water and needed some nutrients from the water to survive. Well, I guess that means that humans who live on islands are eventually going to turn into whale-like creatures too. Just stare at the water, eat from the water, and humans will eventually become mermaids. I mean, that's all it takes, right? Tell me, will the future evolution for those humans look more like this or this? When it comes to your evidence about saltwater isotopes, I'm sure creatures that live in and around saltwater are going to have higher levels of this. But this doesn't indicate evolution, only the environment of these creatures at the time they lived. Evolution is an assumption placed on the back of a bunch of incomplete skeletons placed together in a line. There's even more evidence for this coming up.
Looking through the transitional species, you can see that the nostrils have migrated back to what is now a whale's blowhole. Let's not forget, whales are mammals, not fish. They'd already lost the ability to breathe in water.
Again, we don't have the nostrils for Pakicetus, or for some of the other fossils.
I was surprised that the skull wasn't more complete. I thought you had this full, because I've always seen the models in the museums of the full skull. How did you figure out what the shape of the skull? Was it based on these bones, or did you have other fossils to go from?
So the shape of the skull is based on the fossils that we have, and so we have the parts that have the eye and the brain case and the back of the snout. We don't have the tip of the snout, which is unfortunate because we don't know where the nasal opening was, therefore. However, we did find the whole lower jaw, so we do know how long that snout was. We don't have a sense for its exact shape. So that's based on related animals. Those related animals all have the nasal opening way in the front, so those related animals would be Cuchicitus and Pakicetus. Those have their nasal opening way in the front, so it's likely that Ambulocetus had that too, but we don't know that.
So this really isn't solid evidence of anything. And just because something has a nose and then another creature has a nose in a different place doesn't mean these creatures evolved in a sequence. They could simply be individual creations created in a specific time and place by an outside designer. Here's another great reason to think that this is true.
But the true icing on the cake is the almost complete loss of the hind limbs and pelvis. Because whales evolved from walking land animals, their backbone moved up and down, not side to side like a fish. This meant they no longer required their hind limbs and pelvis. If you take a look at the transitional species, you can clearly see the shrinking of those limbs over time. We even occasionally find living whales today with the vestiges of tiny hind limbs inside its body walls.
The problem with this is that the most recent research has found that these bones serve an important function in sexual reproduction, and that researchers who are trying hard to hold the evolutionary line are trying to justify this discovery by saying that this function evolved separately over time. That's fine and dandy, but what this actually means is that the theory that whales slowly lost their legs over time is not correct, as these bones are for sexual reproduction, and this shoots a giant hole through the whale evolution theory, which pretty much makes it dead in the water. So the entire cake Dan's looking at, including this icing, is really past its expiration date. These recent discoveries about whales probably would have been made a lot sooner if people looked to God, and not evolution, as the creative force. Like what initially drove science years ago, when you think about a super intelligent creator at the start of things, you are going to expect regularity, purpose, function, and complexity to be present in what we see around us. You will expect to find new things. Evolution, on the other hand, inhibits scientific discovery, and has claimed that many things no longer serve a real purpose. Evolutionists have said that you can just cut out your appendix because you don't need it anymore. That's just left over from evolution, even though research now shows that it serves an important purpose in working with the immune system. They've said the same of the coccyx, even though it actually serves as a place to attach many important ligaments and muscles and helps with the important action of sitting down. Same with wisdom teeth, where it was recently found that people in the medical field have been making billions of dollars on removing wisdom teeth, saying that will cause you all sorts of problems, even though this is misinformation being spread to simply make money. It's been found that at least 2/3 of these extractions are completely unnecessary. And it's even the same with DNA, because it's been said for years that we have all this leftover junk DNA, and it's now been discovered that this portion of the DNA works to hold together the genome. It's pretty important. All these things have been said by evolutionists over time, because they assume evolution is true before they have the evidence, and they use things like this as evidence for evolution before they've been explored to the fullest extent to see whether or not that's correct. As seen from the things I just listed, the evidence they do have is crumbling to pieces. So at this point, this sequence is dead. But let's keep going.
Another good question to ask is, how did any transitional form of the species survive by procreation in this whole process? It seems that would become very difficult, especially in the transitional stages. Is anyone asking that question?
No, no one's ever asked that question because it's a stupid one. You're genuinely asking how is it that these animals could have sex?
Oh boy, do we have to get into where babies come from? This is not as simple as you might think. Reproduction is a very complicated process. When you look at Pakicetus, the idea that its reproductive system just evolved is problematic, really problematic when you think about it. Just think about these questions. What happens when one organism evolves the right sexual organ and its mate doesn't? How do they even know to mate, or how to? Where's the sexual drive for doing this coming from? How has the proper reproductive system gotten into place to handle what's going to happen? Is it trial and error in building that reproductive system? Seems like 1,000,001 ways to kill the organism giving birth while that system is being worked out properly to pass the offspring through it. Just consider the birth canal. If by miracle the system is built and its offspring is born, how does the parent even know that it's supposed to care for it, or that its body is somehow miraculously built to care for it? How many miracles are there going to be on this journey? Is it just by chance that evolution has worked out that the body of the parent is going to need to be built to care for the offspring? If that was in a process of evolution, how were offspring being taken care of before that system was in place? Again, so many ways to kill off every single thing, and no real drive behind evolution to build these required systems. So when you think about it like this, what you immediately recognize is that pre-planning is absolutely necessary. If there is no pre-planning, then random trial and error is going to kill everything off. Even in considering the first low-level organisms of evolution, it's pretty hard for DNA to build a system or an organism that doesn't even exist yet. You require pre-planning for the organism or the system, so that the DNA can then be written to build what's been planned out. Same thing with memory. If you believe memory is stored in the brain, a purely naturalistic view, then there's no way evolution can plan ahead to create a storage space in the brain large enough to account for every thought, sensation, or experience. Material containers have limits, and there's no delete button. When you fill up your memory card, it stops working. So this would be the same with low-level organisms. This would kill them pretty quickly, unless there was a pre-planned storage space worked out ahead of time to contain all the information. But at the beginnings of an evolutionary model, there is no system in place to process the information coming in. There is no intelligent mind in evolution, and that's really necessary. In looking at DNA and what it's used to create, what's required is an outside programmer to pre-plan and build organisms and the environments by programming the DNA to do just that. This is what makes sense given what we see around us and within us.
Another good question to ask is, how do we take into account the complete reformation of the outside structure of a creature, and also factoring in that the complete inner workings of the creature have to be completely overhauled and changed?
I think you, like almost all who oppose it, are misunderstanding how evolution works. You don't have one animal that gives birth to a completely different animal. The change is a slow, gradual one. Imagine you are stood at the base of Mount Everest. Let's say that you, at the base, represent the skin of our Pakicetus from the start. Now let's say you want to climb Mount Everest, and the peak represents the skin of a modern day whale. What if you make one step every day? That'd be easy, right? It would take ages, but you could do that, yeah? A quick bit of rough maths would tell us that at this rate it would take you about 80 years to make it to the top. Kind of like your whole life. That's still way quicker than evolution.
The problem with this analogy is that this is an example of intelligent design. I'm assuming the person at the bottom of the mountain is intelligent, and getting to the top of the mountain is a goal. Evolution is nothing like this because it has no intelligence guiding it, and it has no goal. And even then, you know what? It's really hard for an intelligent person to survive on Mount Everest for 80 years. So what about evolution's first low-level organisms trying to survive in an environment in which they couldn't possibly have a clue about what's going on around them? So this example of Dan's is one of design by intelligence, like all supposed evolutionary models are. All computer models trying to show evolution always start with an intelligent programmer, working computer, restrictions on the program, and a goal to reach. That's why they're examples of intelligent design and not evolution. Even that tweet I mentioned earlier from Lawrence Krauss is an example of intelligent design. People like Krauss plan on others not actually reading the article, because when you actually read the article you see they use something called directed evolution, which is not evolution at all. The scientists in this study chose and manipulated genes, and the scientist is intelligent, so this is designed by intelligence, not evolution. So does Krauss understand this, or is he working to spread misinformation?
You know, evolution, especially if you go to like a natural history museum, a lot of times you're going to see bones. You know, bones going from this to this to this to this. The problem is that the bones are not really the problem.
I think I get what you're saying there.
Do you know how complicated the digestive system is? The circulatory system? The nervous system? How are these things changing?
Extremely gradually over a huge amount of time.
If you start out with a land-dwelling creature, these things have to be completely restrung. You have to get the brain from one point to another point. The nose has to go to the top of the head from the front. How does that happen?
I've shown you already. Listen, man.
Yeah, that large amount of time doesn't create any force to restructure these systems, so it's really not an explanation. This is the worst kind of magic, because this doesn't even have a magician. It's like nothing is pulling a rabbit out of a hat that isn't there. And when it comes to that large amount of time, that is also not what the evidence shows. Recently, there have been fossils found with skin, feathers, and other soft tissue, which are things unable to survive more than a few thousand years, and these fossils were not preserved in ice. Included in this is the discovery of intact red blood cells inside T-Rex fossilized bones. The problem with this is that these cells die really quickly, and again, these cells have been found in terrible preservation conditions. The propaganda has been issued to try to explain this, but when you actually read the article that claims to have the answer, it says that they were only able to make red blood cells survive for 2 years in room temperature lab conditions. These bones were not found in these ideal conditions. 2 years is a long way from 1,000, so it's a miracle if these bones are even a few thousand years old. And it's a really long way from 68 million. As 68 million is such a long time, Even if the scientists could get blood cells to survive for 100 years, it still wouldn't be good enough for true science. And so the evolutionary timeline crumbles right here. The resistance to hide these findings can be shown in the harsh treatment of the original person that found the blood cells, Mary Schweitzer, who is on the record of having been treated very badly by her peers, and that this mistreatment has taken a toll on her funding. She is very surprised to find that in searching for tissues, her critics purposely don't follow her methods and then criticize her when they don't get the same results. Well, why on earth would they do that? Well, probably because those critics are trying hard to hold the evolutionary line that crumbles under these findings. The findings don't fit the evolutionary model, so they need to be ignored or discredited. There's no other reason to purposely not follow the methods that are getting the results. With these findings, even the very definition of what a fossil is needs to be changed from simply bone replaced by stone, because as Schweitzer says, if the stone includes proteins of the living animal, then she doesn't even know what the true definition is anymore. Let's go on.
The skin has to become waterproof.
Oh no, the water is seeping into my skin. I can feel it. Oh man, it's touching my bones. Oh wait, hang on, I'm fine.
Yeah, this is like saying that waving your hand through a flame means that your hand is fireproof. You really wouldn't be fine if you were subjected to water for an extended period of time. Your skin would actually quickly break down. You develop sores and infections, even in sterile water, and reduce circulation. To illustrate this, magician and endurance artist David Blaine attempted to stay submerged in a globe of water for a week, and after only 2 days his skin was peeling very badly, and he was already experiencing liver damage. So your example doesn't really hold up, just like your skin wouldn't in the water.
The whale then has to have a diving apparatus too. How does that happen? All of these interchanges have to happen. You know, there are many, many, many systems that are at work within an organism, and they all have to be changed and rerouted.
You are right, some of them do have to be changed and rerouted, but sometimes evolution f***ed up. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is a nerve that, put simply, connects the brain and the larynx. Why then does it go all the way down to the chest, wrap underneath the aortic arch, and then go back up again, when it's merely only a few centimetres away? The reason is because of the development of the circulatory system of our fish-like ancestors.
Grandma? If you think people are overgrown fish, then what's wrong with a person catching someone, chopping them up, and throwing them on the grill? Right, Jeffrey Dahmer?
After I left the home, that's when I started wanting to sort of create my own little world where I could be the one who had the complete control, where I didn't have to bow to anyone else's demands, and I just took it way too far. I didn't feel accountable to anybody. I didn't feel that I had to face what I had done ever, and so there comes a point where a person has to be accountable for what he's done. Can't go around making excuses, blaming other people or other things. So I alone am the one who's responsible for what's happened.
Let me ask, when did you first feel that everyone is accountable for their actions?
Well, thanks to you for sending that creation science material, because I always believe the lie that evolution is truth, the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime, and when we died, you know, that was it. There was nothing. So the whole theory cheapens life. I mean, if a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought, anyway.
Alright, now let's get back to this supposed nerve problem.
When the neck started to elongate and the heart began to lower into the chest, the nerve became caught on the wrong side of the heart. Imagine what that's like for the poor old giraffe. As Richard Dawkins once eloquently said, evolution cannot go back to the drawing board.
Well, the problem is that you continue to listen to people like Richard Dawkins who continue to ignore the facts. First off, you don't know how these inner systems have developed because they have long rotted away when you look at old fossils. Secondly, there's this problem with supposed flaws.
We get used to the idea that evolution is so good at producing beautiful, elegant animals that look as though they've been designed. We forget that sometimes they're not perfect and there are imperfections.
Dawkins is talking about the nerve here. The problem is that you can't even try to claim to see a supposed imperfection without an outside standard of perfection existing to compare it to. So good job pointing to God once again to set that outside perfect standard. Since God exists and is perfect, Dawkins and others are simply not understanding the bigger picture of the design. You don't tell the artist how they should paint, or are you saying this Picasso painting is worthless? Is the drive belt on a car not designed if someone doesn't like it wrapping around the way it does? Thirdly, you are using misinformation about the nerve that has been disproved as far back as the 1800s. The nerve in question does not make its long trip to simply connect the brain and the larynx. To quote from Henry Gray's famous anatomy book, as the recurrent nerve hooks around the subclavian artery, or aorta, it gives off several cardiac filaments to the deep part of the cardiac plexus. As it ascends in the neck, it gives off branches, more numerous on the left than on the right side, to the mucous membrane and muscular coat of the esophagus, branches to the mucous membrane and muscular fibers of the trachea, and some pharyngeal filaments to the constrictor pharyngeus inferior. This can actually be seen if you use an updated model of the nerve instead of one that hides the information. In more recent studies, we continue to learn even more about the important functions of the nerve. Quote, apart from the motor nerves to the larynx, the recurrent laryngeal nerves supply a plethora of autonomic and sensory nerves on its way down and up, and these must have some value ascribed to their sensory autonomic feedback to the brain. So I would stop using this misinformation. We already have enough people trying to force this propaganda down the throats of humanity. Moving on.
Another question that no one asks is that when we have a change, an evolutionary change happen, doesn't that affect the entire ecosystem, the entire food chain? You know, if one creature is evolving, the entire ecosystem, the entire food chain needs to be rapidly evolving to handle this. Everything has to be evolving if one thing is going to switch out of one capacity and take another. So how is the food chain able to be keeping intact and not collapsing on itself when one creature just decides to evolve?
I get it now. Your brain just can't handle the huge timescales it takes for evolution to occur. All of your arguments revolve around this. It's not your fault, you're human. It's tough to imagine. I know.
I've already shown the problem with the timescales, although my arguments revolve around much more than this. You can leave sand on a beach for 1 trillion years and you won't ever return and find a sandcastle sitting on it, unless an outside intelligence designs it. This is the same with atoms in the universe. They need to be sequenced, and I will admit that it's very tough to imagine something like macroevolution, especially when it doesn't make any sense and we never see it happening.
I think the biggest kicker for this article happens at the end. And it says, as evolutionary biologist Neil Shubin points out, quotations, in one sense, evolution didn't invent anything new with whales. It was just tinkering with land mammals. It's using the old to make the new. No. No, 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 no.
Yes, 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 yes. See how easy that is to do? Dear oh dear. I think even I have taken all that I can from this guy.
This point, for some reason, was taken completely out of context by Dan, because what I said right after it was this.
No, 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 no.
First of all, evolution does not invent anything, and it also doesn't tinker. Evolution has no mind. It does not have any capacity to invent or tinker with anything. And this is the rhetoric that is used in articles like this, and this is the problem. We are giving creative ability to randomness and time. It has no creative ability at all. So to force creative ability upon it is very telling. What this shows is that many people treat evolution as some creative intelligence, as if it has some ability to invent and tinker with the atoms in the universe. It does not. Forcing creative ability upon it shows that the problem is with God. which is something predicted to happen, like I quoted in my last video.
Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen.
Like I also pointed out in my last video, I predicted a bunch of hateful comments to get posted in the comments section, and that came true. This is no shock because Jesus predicted that his followers would be hated for sharing the truth. If it was just about science, then there should be no hate in asking questions, especially when it wouldn't matter what you believe because there's no point to the future in a purely scientific view. In a purely scientific view, eventually everything dies in plague, famine, nuclear war, or natural disaster. Then eventually the sun expands and incinerates the earth, and then eventually the entire universe dies in heat death. This would mean that everything you're doing, including researching evolution, is pointless, your life is meaningless, and you have no purpose. Morality, meaning, and purpose would basically become subjective created gods, and that means they wouldn't exist because immaterial gods created in the minds of humans don't really exist. This basically reduces humans to a collection of atoms, and garbage is also a collection of atoms. And so you'd be no more valuable than garbage. It also means that the love you have for family or friends doesn't exist and is nothing but a chemical illusion. So don't be angry, because there's literally no point to anything in your life, including anger. Luckily, as I've shown in this video, there is no evidence for the atheistic evolutionary view of the universe. The universe is designed to look hopeless so that you'll be forced to reach outside of it for hope. As seen in recorded history, the best explanation for the data is that a super-intelligent outside programmer, who is outside of space and time, has coded organisms into reality using DNA, and has placed them in categories: humans, apes, dogs, cats, birds, fish, etc. DNA is a complex code containing sequenced information, and that requires an outside mind to do the programming. To say DNA is just chemicals is like saying software is just electrical signals, or the SOS signal is just lights or sounds. It's all in the sequencing of the materials, and that programmed DNA sequencing is pre-planned to help create complex organisms.
Genes, which from my point of view are absolutely central to biology, genes are information. They are coded information. It even looks like computer information. I mean, a chromosome is a great long computer tape. It's linear, it runs one-dimensional, digital code. It's not binary, it's quaternary, but apart from that, it's just the same as computer tape. It's read in sequence. It's copied and pasted from one part of the organism to another in just the same way as a computer programmer would copy and paste. So biology has turned into computer science.
DNA is a language used by an outside programmer who is able to literally speak life into existence by simply giving the program a command, just like a computer programmer can do. Like the universe and like biological systems, these created organisms have a purpose, which means that you have a purpose. Seeing that humans are the only organisms that think about their creator and about becoming better, then obviously that purpose is to seek for what's best, to get better, and that translates into seek for God, because God is what's best. That's your purpose, and I would get to it. Type seek for God into a search engine, and you'll discover which book has that answer repeated from beginning to end. For those who are already doing this, the best thing to do for Dan and his followers, and people like them, no matter how hateful the comments are, is to pray for them. So please do this, and remember, the weight of the truth means life. We need to listen when the truth speaks.